Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z and Anti for today for a few topics. In this episode, we have the advisory with North Korea targeting researchers, a new variant of NAT Slipstreaming, and some bugs in Libgcrypt, Sudo, and a few other various things mixed in there. Before we jump into topics, tomorrow I will be doing the PS4 stream we were supposed to be doing last Wednesday and then last Friday before I got trolled by my own PS4. Um, so yeah, that will be happening tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. Eastern and 3:30 p.m. Pacific. Right? I think that's how that works out. Um, but yeah, with that said, let's jump into some news. So first, we'll talk about iOS pushed out an update. Apple pushed out an update rather for iOS. They released iOS 14.4, which includes two critical security fixes, a kernel bug and a WebKit bug. We don't have any details at all really on the technical details outside of the kernel bug being. I think they said the kernel bug was a race condition, and the WebKit bug was. I forget what they said about the WebKit bug.
Yeah,
Um,
I wasn't able to find too many details about the actual bugs. I did see that these were being exploited in the wild, though.
yeah, So yeah, the WebKit bug was a logic bug. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. But yeah, like you said, what's notable here is these may have been exploited in the wild, which isn't actually super surprising. When I saw that there was a WebKit bug and a kernel bug, it and like being patched in the same release, it does seem kind of likely that the two bugs probably came from the same source, because that sounds like a chain, right? Which means the kernel bug might even be reachable from Sandbox, which uh, is quite notable because sandboxing is iOS's primary defense against Privesk. So yeah, it seems like there could be an interesting chain coming. They have in the footnote they do say we should get additional details soon. But yeah, very little information here, but we thought we'd bring it up because it's something that could have been discovered in the wild. So it's probably a good idea to update, unless I guess you care about jailbreaking, in which case, if the technical details come out, this chain could be very useful to you, I guess. But otherwise, yeah, it's probably a smart idea to update. Um, Speaking of 0 days, though, let's jump into the, I guess, the meat and potatoes topic here, which is the campaign targeting security researchers from North Korea. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so Tag Google's threat analysis group or Tag team put out a post. So, if you didn't get the notification over Discord or through our Twitter, a few of the write ups we've covered in the past, as recently as last week's episode, were apparently posts made by North Korean state actors who were not only trying to infiltrate the security community, but also target security researchers, which might have gone as far as even using a Chrome 0 day chain to get into the machines of researchers. We ended up finding out about this through Google's link flagging on the podcast. We originally thought it was overzealous automation flagging write ups because they were write ups, but then Tag put out this post and it turned out to be a way more serious situation.
And
So
in
we've,
fairness, we have been kind of tagged by Google's AI before with there was a HackerOne post in like episode 5 or something, that they came out I want to say it was a couple months ago now, but they came out. It's like episode 5. Your link to HackerOne is malicious and like against community guidelines. So we've been hit by some of those guideline issues before, and so when I saw this URL getting hit by, I was kind of thinking it was around the same thing, but it does look like I don't believe anybody has officially captured the ODay that was in use, but there have been some people on Twitter who believe it was actually one of the exploits that are during last week's episode we cut ourselves talking about the exploit, but it was a WebAssembly issue that was posted on the attack blog itself, uh, detailing the exploit that they were launching against people visiting their own website.
yeah, I put out a tweet on my personal Twitter that was it was just saying like using a 0 day to pop the researchers you want to target, then claiming credit for that and doing a write up on it, and it was the stonks image. It's so weird. I don't think I've ever heard of somebody doing that. But yeah, I will quickly shout out before we get into like the details of the topic. We have removed the links from our past videos, but if you visited the Broven blog, which contained the write-up for the Chrome WebAssembly issue that Z mentioned that we covered last week. The explicit always good post from episode 55, which wasn't a main topic, but we did briefly mention and cover with CVE 2020 1034. And the DOS to RCE, a new technique to exploit V8 null pointer dereferences from episode 49. If you checked out the blog post from any of those episodes, especially if you visited the site using Chrome, check for the indicators of compromise from the tag post. If you find an indicator of compromise, or maybe even if you don't, you might want to do a system wipe regardless. I know I did. Because even though like they have a list of IOCs, it's possible that they missed some or one didn't make it into the list. So I would just do a wipe to be safe, but yeah, it's worth going back and checking on that. So this really shook the security community, and especially Z and I, because it sucks to think that people could have potentially gotten infected through topics we covered. Now, obviously, when there's 0 days involved, I mean, there's not really much you can do there. What are you going to do? Just stop using browsers? I mean, that's not really realistic. There were some people saying that you shouldn't be visiting blogs from your host machine, and you should be using a VM. Like, I nobody really does that. I mean, let's be
I mean,
totally honest
maybe
here.
if you what was it, Cubes OS? Is that the one that does the sandboxing, I believe? I mean, there definitely are workflows that you can do that would be using, a VM for everything. It is more secure to do that, but most of us kind of live in a more practical world, not
Yeah,
purely focused on that. With something like this, it's kind of interesting just because it was more limited in scope. Oftentimes, when you see the browser ODage dropping, you've got, well, either it's very targeted, like targeting specific individuals, a nation state targeting some particular individual. In this case, you've kind of got like targeting a smaller group of individuals, so there would have been a lot less noise coming on there. So I thought that was
yeah,
kind of interesting. I mean, it does sound a little bit weird. So the actual attacks, it seemed like they were also hitting people up on Twitter, talking to them about wanting to collaborate, and then providing them with a Visual Studio project that had an actual bug that they were apparently trying to exploit and just hadn't figured out or weren't able to do, and trying to get the other researcher to open, run the Visual Studio project, and try and work on that exploit also. It seems a little bit weird to me that they would be using this malicious project on the targets that they were actually interested in, like on the people that they were actually trying to target, and then dropping an ODE on Chrome, which was a lot less targeted, just whoever happens to visit the website. That felt a little bit odd to me.
I guess trying to make sure you want to hit those like priority targets, as it were. Um, and on that note, I am a little bit offended that I wasn't targeted here. I mean, when I looked at my DMs and I didn't see the North Korean hack, the people that tagged Google tagged as North Korean hackers, I was like, well, what did I have to do, man?
Well, probably be involved with Chrome exploitation. I'm not sure if I
True.
was reached by them or not. I had one person, like the timing seems really weird. He was really pushy to try and collaborate with me, but he also kind of seemed like a little bit of an idiot. So I'm not, and not one of the matching names. So either it was a completely different name, reach out to me on Discord, but oh no, the timing was a little bit weird for me. I did not receive any Visual Studio project though either. So I feel like it's probably unrelated, but like right in the right timing. So out
I
of
mean, to
chat, Wubble Space Telescope mentions I don't use Chrome, so I'm going to pretend that's why I wasn't hit. I mean, it does seem like they only had a Chrome exploit. I know I've still taken kind of the usual actions of wiping and stuff, just in case, because I definitely visited the website. While I largely use Firefox, it's still just kind of for or good practice, I guess. And I've needed to wipe my system for a while anyhow, so gave me an excuse.
just use Linux. No one who's using Linux seems to have been affected. Just my small quip to be an a-hole.
I mean, I saw some people legitimately saying like, if you were using like Mac OS or something, you would have been fine.
I
Okay.
mean,
Well, on that
the
note,
one time.
Andy, what can you tell us about, or can you tell us anything about
Mhm.
this particular APT group? Like,
Yeah.
Have there been other campaigns from them that they've targeted? Who else have they targeted? Or like what else do we know about these guys?
See, I think the big part is, so obviously it's been attributed to North Korea, and that was, in regards to, I guess, some of the binaries that were dropped. So as far as I understand it, the Chrome, like you said, has never, like the Chrome exploit, no one has kind of ponied up and showed what it was. So it's hard to know if that was, anything significant, or if someone was just believing that's how it worked. Maybe there was more to it. But the Visual Studio project, so it's been analyzed by Microsoft, and that's how I believe they attributed the malware to it, because they actually have where it goes and runs PowerShell and directly pulls out an actual piece of malware that called Clackring, I think. But I don't know if it was actually ever 100% associated, that specific malware, with North Korea. I believe it just had to do typically with the methodology. But I don't know if there's actually been a distinct, I can double check. I don't know if anyone actually said this is like APTXX, right? Like they gave a specific number. But this is right up North Korea's alley. So if you do some Googling, you'll see that like North Korea has been pretty adamant about targeting people through LinkedIn. I think there was a like a bunch of cryptocurrency users that a few years back, or I think even last year, were being targeted in a very similar manner, but approached on LinkedIn to talk about some cryptocurrency stuff, and then later found out they were compromised. And that's kind of how North Korea has been, operating in the past few years, rather than trying to be as crazy as they can, just targeting people in the most simple way. So, in terms of attribution, I think it's hard to necessarily give it the exact group, because North Korea has multiple groups that do different functions, so I think though that, regardless, if Microsoft and Google can both say this is North Korea, then you can probably know that it's North Korea, right? Especially from, kind of an analysis standpoint. So to back it up though, I don't actually myself, I haven't analyzed any of the malware. Any of the things that you might go and see, like the website, I can't go and analyze myself because it's not available anymore. So it makes it a little hard for that attribution
Has
without.
it been taken down entirely? I never actually checked. I know Google put a block on it, like saying that it was a malicious link, but I thought you could still go past that if you wanted to go to the site. Because I actually did it, because at the time I didn't think it was, I didn't know it was malicious. I thought it was just Google being overzealous again, and I clicked through it to go to the page. But are you not able to do that anymore?
Not when I last checked a couple of days ago, unless they decide to bring it back up just to taunt people. But I I clicked through just to see. I'm not gonna say what OS I'm on, but I'm on a different OS than the one they targeted, so I wasn't all too concerned. But yeah, I mean, it looks like it's down.
Okay,
Yeah,
fair enough.
so I think that's the hard part, is, as with anything in type of like threat intelligence world, is if you don't have access to it, like maybe the original researchers, it can be a little difficult, because I can't always verify against specific if it's binaries as well. But I think what's important as a takeaway, rather than like who did it, since it likely is North Korea, I think what's actually more interesting, and that was kind of touched on already, is the people who are supposed to be smarter than this were getting hit pretty good. So I think that's really an interesting point, that everyone kind of assumes like no one's going to bother with me, or I've always assumed that security people are the important people, and I figured it was already happening. So I'm surprised at how surprised everyone is. Is that silly? Am I the dumb one here?
No, I
So
don't think you're wrong about that. Like, I highly doubt this is the first time security researchers are being targeted.
Right.
I think it's one of the first times that we're really kind of getting it called out and confirmed that that is the case, that security researchers were being targeted. Um, and also just, I think, a little bit of the methodology here of starting to befriend them a little bit. Somebody mentioned that they had the James 0x40, I think it was. Somebody else had, or somebody they knew had vouched for them. And kind of getting into it on that personal level. Like, I'm not sure what how common that necessarily is, but there was a certain personal aspect to a lot of the attacks being launched, like just getting involved with the research community, actually putting out some write-ups and stuff. It does seem like some of the things that they put out were fake. As far as I can tell, their blog posts were using legitimate vulnerabilities, but they did have some tweets involving basically what looked like fake vulnerabilities. I think there was like a fake defender bypass thing or something. that people were calling out.
Yeah.
But it does seem like at least some of the blog posts also may have been written by guests on the blog who weren't actually part of the campaign, but were uh, just like, hey, let's collaborate here, write a blog for us and we'll post it. And I think
Coerced into
something
doing
like,
it, yeah.
yeah, like coerced into it. And I think that is at least a little bit novel in terms of how they've started trying to gain a reputation within the security community.
I mean, that's kind of a thing though, is like security researchers are all pretty collaborative, at least in my experience. But I'm pretty sure the zero-day community, while tends to be hush hush, is also collaborative when necessary, right? So if someone that comes up to you looks vouched to a degree, is willing to work with you, and you go and say, well, what do I have to lose if they're willing to share information with me? You know what I mean? So like I assume that was where a lot of people, because there was one of the Twitters had 1,200 followers and the other 600 or something like that. So I'm not really surprised. I think it's one of those things that, like you said, is already happening. I wonder though, really, if these niche communities, if this is really just like the tip of the iceberg. I could see why they would drop so many 0 days, by the way, in hopes of getting more 0 days, because you invest one or two and get a dozen 0 days. Well, that's a pretty good investment. But yeah, I think that this is probably just something that has already been happening, is going to continue happening, but probably, it's similar to when regular researchers get busted for doing like criminal stuff. He goes like, I was talking to this person all along. I think this is just kind of part of the course for them, but yeah, specifically for you guys, I would be curious if you've never had anyone else you've ever just been curious, like, this person can't be a legit researcher, right? Does that not happen? People just not.
I've definitely had some people who have approached me that do like I was just mentioning how I think somebody approached me in December, um, and wanting to collaborate on Chrome exploitation, which I don't do, so I had basically denied it off that front. But talking with him, like no, he didn't really seem like a researcher, but it seems like the guys that were involved with this could kind of walk the walk also. Have done some of that
Yeah.
exploitation and weren't just kind of idiots. So
No,
that's where I don't think the person who I spoke with in December was actually involved with this at all. But the timing was a little bit weird, and it is something that happens. Like there absolutely are the people that will try and infect you, but they're usually playing, I guess, a bit of a shorter game in my experience, or maybe I've just been pwned for so long and don't even know it.
right.
But just not spending as much time building up that reputation. I think that
Maybe.
feels like kind of the bigger difference here, is they did try to build up a reputation, have other people who would vouch for them within the community.
Yeah, it's
I
that infiltration and deception aspect, I think, that really shook people more than just being targeted for exploitation, right? I think it was more of that, because there's a psychological angle to it too. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the WikiLeaks versus CIA talk from CCC. Um, when this type of story comes out, you start to question, oh, I wonder if that like glitch I had a couple days ago was related to that. Like, you start to question things that happened over the last little while, and it hits you more than just in a technological sense. Like, even if you weren't attacked, you think you might have been, and that's where like people start wiping, which you probably should do anyway. But like there's some interesting like fallout from that on the psychological angle too.
yeah, I think that's a good point. I guess I have to look at it from a different way. And when in threat intelligence, like, it's a little bit different than some of the other security communities, like the 0 day development, in that you kind of assume 24/7, especially if you're like someone who focuses on like e-crime, or if you do publish on nation state, you kind of assume there's going to be some level of retribution. Like, someone's going to either try and do the same stupid crap, come to you and go, hey, I really love that research. Do you want to open this file of my research? Nah, thanks. Or, they try and do the social engineering. So I think because it's a daily, it's just different. I think there was more trust in the 0 day community than maybe some other areas of cybersecurity, where you kind of have no choice to just trust everybody, because the gain of targeting someone who's doing regular cybersecurity research can be a little higher sometimes. But the 0 day community, it's obviously very high. But I figured what surprised me was I would never think anyone would bother to target those researchers, because I would just assume they're invulnerable. Like, how are you going to target someone who literally develops exploits, right? So I felt like everyone had like a more comfortable air knowing that who would dare do something like this? Does that kind of make sense? Like, it's like trying to go to the dragon. You're like, there's no way, dude. All we've got is a toothpick to stab this thing. It literally
And
can
that's
breathe
probably
fire.
why people got popped too, was they thought like people wouldn't target us, or if I was being targeted, I would know it. I don't click on links I don't know, or well, I guess here, I guess you don't know the blog because that's why people got hit. But like, I don't like download things I don't know. For example, like you could follow pretty like hygienic security practices here and still have gotten hit because there was a 0 day potentially involved, right? Um, I did want to jump back on something you said though, which is the value. There were some people that were really skeptical at first because there's that question like burning a Chrome and possible Windows 0 day to pop researchers. People were thinking that doesn't really make sense because if you wanted like if you were a nation state and you wanted exploits, why not just buy them? Um, if you can buy them like for a nation state, exploits really aren't that expensive, right? But I have kind of an interesting angle on this because if you think about it, and this actually did come from North Korea, I think it makes a lot more sense of having the intent of stealing 0 days than it would for other nation states. Because for most governments, it wouldn't really make sense to launch a campaign to steal 0 days because they could just buy them. But where a country like North Korea is going to be sanctioned, and I didn't actually double check on this, but I imagine they would fall under like the Wassenaar Agreement, right? Like I doubt it's legally possible to sell exploits to North Korea for anybody in that agreement.
Yeah, well,
Um,
they so the way the Wassenaar arrangement works is that basically the countries within the Wassenaar agreement you can export to. So they won't
yeah,
really fall under it. This is more nitpicky, but they would fall outside of that arrangement.
yeah. So it's a lot harder for North Korea to be able to buy those O-days. You have to find people who are willing to sell them outside of like the legal jurisdiction, right? So it's where it's harder for them to obtain them. It makes a lot more sense from a like value perspective to potentially burn one to get more. So I thought that was kind of an interesting angle that a lot of people weren't really considering. Maybe that's just because like that take is just kind of off base. I don't know, but
I think you're right. You don't mind me touching on it. I think that's actually a really good point. Um, I think it's like when people like kind of generalize North Korea, like if you look at the actions of like the North Korean hackers, right? What they've always focused on is like, let's say, for instance, they go and say, well, why? Like a lot of people ask, well, because China gives infrastructure and all kinds of things, has trained North Korea through all this, why wouldn't they be giving them 0 days? And it's kind of the logic of if I go and spend $10 million for 0 days and I just hand it off to this possibly less skilled teammate of mine, isn't it better for me to just use it? So it's by default, they're not going to be sourcing a lot of 0 days, even from their little team member nations. But the real big part here is North Korea, even as a nation state, is pretty poor, right? But that's why you see a lot of their targeting, at least from one of the few APT groups they do have, is specifically like that's why they're targeting exchanges. They don't have a lot of money, so they have to be creative in how they target things, right? They can't just the reason I think that they used 0 days in this manner was because the return on investment was likely going to be a lot higher, right? Let something else burn in hopes of getting, X, Y, and Z different exploits. I assume that was their logic. So I think that when you kind of go at it, understand that North Korea really is about trying to maximize every compromise they can get. They may have only had, I don't think they only had that 0 day, but they may have literally had to sit there and go, we've got 1 or 2 or 3 0 days left that we can really use, which by the way, they don't leverage a lot of 0 days at least from what I can tell. So they may have just said, look, what's the way we can maximize it? And that's it, going after security researchers. And they've done it before. They go through LinkedIn and different measures. So I think it actually is right within what they've been doing, targeting through social media. I think they just took it up a notch. Probably if they had not been so reckless, I genuinely think in about a year or two, if they really waited, which they couldn't, it's North Korea. I think it's different. That kind of from a watering hole attack, you could probably target so many researchers if you build up that community and that trust. And then now that you've kind of mapped everyone out, you've built up a community, you've gained some trust. I bet you they could have compromised a hell of a lot of people as opposed to just kind of the scattered approach they took. And they probably actually could have too. We don't know. But that long-winded thing was to say that North Korea, I think you're right. North Korea does not have the same means as every other nation state. So this actually really made sense in terms of leveraging a 0 day to hopefully maximize on what they do have to gain even more. So That was long-winded.
And on that financial angle, this was kind of interesting because I had a discussion with a few people about this too. Some of the people who confirmed they were compromised with this because they'd opened the malicious VS Project files. They said that shortly after, there were they attempted to log into like their Coinbase accounts and into their like cryptocurrency wallets to extract crypto. And to me, that seemed really strange. Like a nation state doing like skitty, like criminal, like Russian hacker stuff. Like it just seemed weird to me. But when you throw in that financial angle of, well, they're doing this because they don't have a lot of money to purchase 0 days, and they probably want to get money, like you were talking about them targeting exchanges. I mean, going after cryptocurrency as a last ditch effort does, I guess, kind of make sense in that context. So that is another angle I wanted to throw on there. Was they did try to, after they were caught, they did try to leverage it past what they'd already had. They were like, okay, well, shit, we got burned. Let's try to see if we could steal anything from wallets or
Yeah, I
bank
mean,
details or whatever.
but once they've been burned, I feel like that kind of makes sense. Like now they just need to utilize this, like before they have time on their side, they can go and kind of play the long game, wait it out, and kind of distance themselves from the point of compromise to the point of actually using that information. And yeah, once they got burned, once the Google Take post came out, then you started seeing people talking about, like, it seemed like they pivoted to actually using that information, because at that point, people are going to start changing all of that information. They've been burned. Like, we were on the same night, we had started wiping things, changing passwords and all of that, and we weren't even necessarily compromised through it. So, I mean, like, it makes sense that they would immediately pivot to trying to do that. I do want to take one question out of chat, which was from Elkeys. Do we know if they had any luck and got some 0 days? And I'm not sure. I don't know if we've had anything necessarily confirm that like they got exactly this 0 day. We have had some researchers who got owned, who mentioned that they didn't have any. I have to imagine those that might have just wouldn't have mentioned it. So I would assume they at least got some out of this. Just given kind of the scope of who they were targeting. That said, it does also seem like one of the things they targeted was like they had a kernel exploit. Like the visuals, the actual code of the Visual Studio, or maybe this was only, I believe it wasn't Rich in Seattle. There's somebody else that was pretty vocal about what had happened on Twitter. I forget their handle right now. But
I think that there was a user on Reddit, and he might be on Twitter, and he said Hyperion Gray was one of the individuals who said they got compromised.
yes,
And I don't know if
that's
they
who I
might
was
have been
thinking
trolling.
of. And
Might have
what
been
they
trolling,
did
but
though, they mentioned that they were running this under a VM, I believe.
Mhm.
Which makes sense. Like if you're going to look at a kernel exploit, you're probably going to run it under a VM so you can do the debugging.
Right.
Like that just seems almost like an oversight, because you're not going to run your kernel exploit on your host just because you can't debug your host when the kernel crashes. Well, apart from some more unique setups, I suppose.
But they
So
might have assumed there was a testing VM anyways, and thought if I can get access to that,
true.
I could be wrong, but I assumed that was maybe the theory, that if I can't get full access, maybe I'm going to get access to their testing VM where they run all this stuff and see at least their crashes and other stupid stuff.
That's
That'd be a
very
Yeah,
good
valid.
you
point.
can. That is a good point. You can get some information out of just seeing the VM even.
It's a big swing, but maybe.
Yeah, but no, I
Uh,
actually I wasn't even thinking about that. I was saying, because I tend to use a lot of throwaway VMs. Like if I am using a VM, it's literally just like create a new snapshot, run whatever, do whatever, and then go
Mhm.
back to the original. Like I don't keep a lot of state, but I could imagine people keeping some state, especially if you're working on like a single exploit and then it's, oh, I've got this one to just try really quickly from somebody. Fair enough. I can see the reuse happening.
Yeah.
So they could probably get something off that. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that they did get some 0 days out of it. That said, I don't think anybody's going to admit that they had 0 days that got compromised through it.
I think a lot of researchers are not going to want to admit that they were compromised, and that's the only thing I
That
wonder
too.
with the 0 day. I don't want to be the person to say it fully, but there's been really no discovery of the Chrome thing. Like it's really just been speculation, as far as I understand. So part of me really does wonder if, in a bad way, that are some people literally just ran the Visual Studio project and that was literally it, and they're just kind of too ashamed to admit it? Or because it does seem interesting that no one was able to procure that, especially if Microsoft was investigating this for months on end. And to my understanding, this was posted on Reddit, NetSec community, right? The malicious blog post, possibly. So,
Yeah,
you
the
know,
DOS-RC one was posted on Reddit. That's actually where I first found the blog myself and started looking at it, was back when that was posted.
but the amount of victims could be so high and not one person to notice a Chrome 0-day. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just.
So with the Hyperion Grey, he mentioned like that he had a crash or I'm sorry, since I don't have my notes written on this part, I might have the names wrong, but somebody did say they got a crash and it was like they had noted what the CVE was. It
Interesting.
does seem like that's what I was kind of referring to when I said no official source have actually confirmed that. It does seem like both Google and Microsoft, the way they talk about it as being somebody accessed the website and then shortly after that, the malware was running. It does seem like there's some devices were probably compromised that had like endpoint protection, and they were able to see the information from that. They were able to see the access to the website, then the compromise from there. Like
Okay.
I don't think it's just people lying. Just
Oh,
given the
no,
way
no,
that
no,
both
no.
Google and Microsoft have reported on it, it seems to me quite likely that the endpoint protection was able to at least correlate the compromise and the actual running of the actual appearance of malware with the visiting of the website to kind of say that without actually having a crash to confirm it.
And that's true. Yeah, that was something that Microsoft published on that they said they discovered months ago, was their endpoint protection across one of their clients detected that. So yeah, and I wasn't trying to belittle and say like anyone who is probably just lying. I just meant more of, I think a lot of times it's embarrassing to admit you've been compromised, and it may just be worth going and saying, yeah, that must have been the way. Whereas that was always kind of getting up. Yeah, I do think that there's a validity to it. And I was curious, though, how many people probably did actually open up just that project alone and got compromised. So it's kind of an awkward situation, though, in any regard, honestly, for all these people. So I just feel bad. But hopefully, honestly, unless there's more to bring up, I really just hope for most people that it's kind of like a lesson learned that, I mean, I'm not surprised that security researchers were targeted, but for myself, since I'm not an active zero-day developer, I was just surprised that zero-day, or exploit developers were kind of the target, because as we kind of talked about, it was just it's a spooky thing. Who would you go after? Not those types of people. So that's kind of my last two.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, this exploit must have been remarkably stable considering how bold their strategy was of hitting the security researchers, like you were saying, and the fact that also, like you were saying, nobody caught it for so long. Like, it must have been a really damn stable bug, and didn't really cause much noise. And there's also the Windows 0-day angle too, because I think they mentioned like this would have had to have gotten past like Defender to install like the malware the way it did. So like both exploits in the chain must have been pretty damn good exploits for this to have happened the way it did.
Well, so on the
Um,
exploit front, I believe it's like at least the prevailing theory that I've seen is that the exploit being used was that WebAssembly one we were talking about last week and cut from the episode.
which is weird because I don't remember that one being something that you would think of as super stable.
Well,
It seemed like it would be finicky, but I don't know. I don't really know much about WebAssembly or like exploitation in that area, so maybe I'm wrong there. But
let me grab my notes on on that topic here actually. Um Remember kind of what it was. Oh, so that was the one that called abort. So you'd get that early abort and it would get a use after phrase. So that could actually be kind of stable. It seemed like if they were able to control the next allocation, so they had a pretty consistent next to use, like um or next allocation after that use after free. You've got controlled. You control the data being copied. You control how large the read is. It would give you a pretty powerful primitive.
no, okay, maybe I was
So I mean that is
misremembering it.
actually,
So
I wasn't thinking about the actual exploit too much, but now that we're kind of coming up on it, like it was a reasonably powerful primitive, I think. And for anybody who's wasn't actually listening live, since we didn't include the or ourselves talking about it on the podcast that went up on YouTube and Spotify and such, the actual issue was effectively being able to trick the browser into aborting after it had finished, after the promise had already been a JavaScript promise had already been resolved. So it would free on abort, it would end up freeing the object. In which case you can get like a second use of it, but it had already returned the first object, so it returned the now freed object, and you can get a reuse out of it. And if you reuse it with a new object that has like different sizes, there were a few different primitives that they gained from it. But effectively use that free, and with the different size, you'd be able to read more or less, or write more or less, or write out of bounds.
Yeah, so maybe I was misremembering the specifics. I thought it was an unstable exploit, but maybe I'm thinking of something else we covered.
Well, so I
But
don't think
yeah,
we got too much detail on the actual exploit strategy. It just
it mostly
they
focused
did
on the
seem
bug.
to.
Yeah.
Like, it does seem like it's one of those bugs that actually could be reasonably stable.
Hmm. Yeah, this is pure speculation. Um, I do have one more thing I wanted to pull out of chat. And sorry, I know we have been spending a while on this topic. This is probably going to be like the last point from me. But somebody said in chat, if I can find it because it's been a little while, but they were saying that's my point about like Chromium being used everywhere. Like nowadays, almost everything is Chromium based. That is one big like concern I have with the centralization in like software development, man. You have Edge that recently just went to Chromium. It's switched from Chakra and it's now people call it Edgium. There's Chrome, which is obviously going to be using Chromium. Um, I like you have Chrome on Android. You're going to be. I think does Node.js use Chrome? I think it or sorry what am I thinking of? Does Electron use Chrome? I think
Yeah,
it does.
Electron does.
So, like, there's so many things out there that use Chrome under the hood, even if people don't realize it. And when you have so many like things using the same software, that software becomes such a juicy target to exploit because you can exploit so many devices that are running Chrome nowadays, and that's why Chrome exploits are worth like hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's so many things that run Chrome. You have Android, you have the Chrome browsers, you have like it is concerning, and I do feel like there needs to be more fragmentation, I guess, coming in when it comes to browsers and usage. And it's sad because Firefox is kind of spiraling down too. I mean, Mozilla made a post last year saying that they were cutting down the development on Firefox. They killed the Rust fork, I believe, of Firefox. So it's just like it seems like everything's moving towards Chrome, and that's kind of a dangerous path. But I don't know if there's anything that can really be done to stop that anyway, but I just wanted to like point that out that is a growing problem that's happening.
I did want to ask you guys, since you look at it more in that vein, I think when I talk to people about Chromium, and I kind of have the same concern, is not even just from a security but privacy perspective, but past that, when you start getting all these other people that then in turn start, kind of using Chromium and submitting things to it, right? Since it's open source, I believe, would it then over time you have to worry even more that I think a lot of people go and say, well, it's a Google thing, so it's going to be safe, but I don't know if I believe that, and I worry more that now with all the different browsers and even more using Chromium, I feel like people are just going to keep piling into it and then adding their functionality that was maybe lost when they ported over to Chromium, and then they're just going to be bringing in actually more bugs and more vulnerabilities. Is that stupid? Is that far-fetched?
It's like
So
the Android problem all over again, honestly.
yeah,
When
like
you're talking about something like that.
there is a little bit of that Android problem where you've got just a very diverse ecosystem of different deployments. Where you've got all the different browsers like Brave, Vivaldi, all of them like will all be based on different Chromium versions or slightly different Chromium versions. That said, Chrome has at least, I would say, done some things right when it comes down to how they've done security, in that they try to centralize a lot of the security aspects. They're not like just implementing these sort of ad hoc here's like the security mechanism tossed in, but they try and centralize so everything kind of has to go through it and forcing proper development. When it comes, and that's something that Firefox has been a little bit more ad hoc when it comes to some of the security features. So I mean, like I feel like Chrome is at least doing some things right that make it a little bit harder for it to uh be compromised in that way, for that to really be the root of a lot of vulnerabilities, because they do, even if people are adding more and more functionality, it is creating a larger attack surface. But Google, I think, is taking a lot of the right steps. I mean, with the sandboxing, for example, it doesn't really matter if your code, well, it does matter if your code's insecure because it gets people into the sandbox, but they still have to deal with the sandbox then. Like, it's not, there's the layers of defense that Google has. It's not just like you have to implement the security if you want it, but it's there, and it's hard to either disable it if you want to disable it, or impossible to do so.
Well, and I think you're right. I just know that from the threat actors, like the baddies, quote unquote, when you start limiting, like they don't have to just target, 5 different browsers or what have you, right? They can go and say, well, if I do focus on this one, it's going to be there. And you're right in that I do think they handle a lot of the security better. I think it's the smaller security problems that start bubbling up where, like, even silly things like malicious plugins, or extensions. If it works now on Chromium, well, in every browser is based off of Chromium, you start seeing issues like that crop up where it doesn't always have to be the biggest and baddest exploit. It's a lot of threat actors find weird things that they can trigger that now work across the board. So I think that's where I worry, is just not necessarily the everything's going to go to hell. Just it will kind of allow some people to be a little more advantageous now that they don't have to make something work across the board. But it's a very strong point that I do think Chromium does try to at least do the right thing in terms of security posture. Whereas, I think we've talked before about how Mozilla and IE and have tended to kind of be part of exploit kits pretty frequently because they're not typically as secure. So valid points.
Yeah, and I mean, it's going to happen as Chrome is more used. It's a similar thing with Windows. Why don't you see a lot of malware being written to target Linux? Because the user base is on Windows. I mean, you still see plenty of compromises of like Linux services. I mean, that happens all the time, but you don't see as much malware going for that.
You don't really
It's
see
going to be,
ransomware doing that, yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. Well, I think we have seen some ransomware kind of doing more Linux stuff actually, but
Not nearly as much, though, as
no,
Windows.
not as much. Just the user base there does make it a nicer target, which is why, like, in some sense, like, people who are running Firefox against this Brovin blog, may not have been hit by it, simply because they were using an abnormal setup. And abnormal in this case just meaning using Firefox instead of Chrome.
Yeah, you got lucky, essentially, that you didn't get hit.
Yeah, like, there is a certain, it's kind of security by obscurity, in a sense. There is a certain degree of security that you do get by running an obscure system. By having some of that obscurity, like, security by obscurity, like, there is some security there, it's just not something that should be depended upon, but it's not, like, negligible either. It's just, you shouldn't rely upon it, and I think that's true in this case, too.
Yeah. So I think we will move on, Auntie. I know you probably want to get out of here. We're hitting like the 45-minute mark. We've been talking on this topic for quite a while. But yeah, did you have any like final thoughts that you wanted to mention on this topic or any other topic before you jump off?
I mean, I guess to give kind of my last parting shot, I mean, I think the summary here is really, uh, never assume. I think that's really a good example that, you're not worth targeting, and that even if you're not the initial target, this is how it kind of pans out sometimes, just by nature of being in those communities. I think, every person's kind of a target. So I'm hoping, I always hate these things, but in some small ways, I'm glad these things happen every once in a while so that people kind of remember, like, okay, I can't just go and trust every single thing, because unfortunately, this is exactly how it works. So I'm excited to, see further developments from people who maybe get more analysis, but otherwise, no, I think it was a great conversation. I'm going to head out. Enjoyed hopping on. Thanks, guys.
All right, cool. Thanks for coming on, Auntie. We appreciate it. It's been a while.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
All right, so we'll jump into a new topic. Offensive Security put out their EXP 301 course, which is a Windows user mode exploit development course. which is one of the courses intended to replace cracking the perimeter along with Web 300 and Pen 300, which we covered back in episode 51. In the blog post, they posted the course syllabus and registration information. So I figure we'll probably go through the course syllabus first, talk about some of the things the course covers. So prime among them seems to be tool usage, using things like WinDebug, IDA, um, just being able to debug on Windows essentially,
Yeah,
and reverse engineer.
so there's definitely like a good segment on WinDebug. Seems really limited. In fact, I don't like their use of IDA here. I mean, whatever they use it, it doesn't really matter. But like, this is their IDA section I've just pulled off. Literally, it's basic functionality, search functionality, and they have the static dynamic analysis synchronization. So literally linking it with your debugger, so you have the information being shared. Make a change in one place, see it over on IDA, or make a change in IDA, see some of it over in WinDebug. It's doing that link, so like you're not getting very deep into IDA with what's covered in this. So like
Yeah, I
at
mean,
least
this is
with
stuff you get comfortable with in the first few hours, pretty much.
yeah, which is kind of why I feel like they should have chosen something besides IDA Pro. Because there's no reason why they couldn't have used it here. That would be free and accessible for users rather than encouraging the use of IDA Pro. That said, you already know if you've listened to the podcast that we kind of have a chip on our shoulder when it comes to IDA.
I mean, to
Encouraging using.
balance that out, IDA's like Windows API matching functionality is kind of unmatched. So I can totally see why you would want to push people to use IDA for doing Windows reversing.
Yeah,
Ghidra is
it has the
shines more
batteries
with
in
Linux.
it. Well,
Um,
Ghidra can get pretty close with IDA if you add like all the symbols and stuff in. It doesn't do that by default, whereas IDA does give you that by default. Like its batteries included in a sense for that.
exactly. Yeah.
Which is fair. I mean, it is a Windows course. It's just because they don't get very deep into IDA, it just feels like, maybe they should have used something free, but that is like not really a huge issue. IDA is the industry standard software that you're probably going to end up using regardless if you get into this professionally. But that leads into another thing. As a certification, I kind of expect it to be some that says like you're at a level to professionally do some of this. This is a 32-bit Windows exploitation course. 32-bit is kind of the emphasis there. When it comes to actually covering the exploitation, it gets you up, roughly to ROP. Covers ROP in here. Covers, calling virtual alloc, doing some stuff to defeat DEP. Basically creating a memory page that has the read-write execute permissions. Pretty standard technique for that. You ROP to it, but it's 32-bit. I think that is kind of a big deal breaker to me. I was really excited about this course. I was looking forward to see what they'd come out with. And I'm really disappointed by what they actually have in here because for $1,300, they don't have a 30-day option. There's only a 60-day option, 90-day option. So for $1,300, this is very much a beginner course on exploit development.
Yeah.
Only stack-based overwrite, so it covers kind of your classic EIP overwrite and an SEH overwrite. That's really all it covers in terms of the actual exploits. It covers like egg hunting and some shell coding stuff. Good practices, covers a little bit of reverse engineering. In particular, just like hooking an API or, hooking functions, being able to modify them at that point. Cat 3009 out of chat, no 64-bit, that's correct. This is purely 32-bit x86 Windows. Like, it doesn't feel very updated, is kind of my issue here, because it's not covering, like, yes, you can argue that once you've learned these basics on 32-bit, you're going to be able to learn 64-bit. That said, there is a pretty big difference when it comes to the calling conventions, and thus when it comes to trying to do ROP or something. And it covers the SEH overwrites, which somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, but with 32-bit, the SEH pointers would be stored as part of the stack frame. On 64-bit, they're out of the stack frame now, so you don't get it when you don't get access to the SEH overwrite when you have an overflow anymore. So it's for an updated course, I would expect it to work Like, I would expect it to be more up to date. And don't get me wrong, there are things you can learn from this. It's not like you can learn anything at all from this. But for $1,300, which is, again, in fairness, not a crazy price for such a course, I just would expect it to be more updated. Like, most beginner exploitation courses now do cover 64-bit. I would have liked to see something, maybe a little bit about having a heap overflow, not necessarily the allocator attacks, and just cover like heap spraying, something like that. And in fairness, heap spraying is a little bit more difficult on Windows than it is on Linux, but I think it's something you could cover to be an intermediate course, and this just feels more like a beginner course to me. If you're going to learn from it, like, great, it does deal with at least DEP and ASLR, which was lacking from OSE original. So there's some fair stuff in there. It doesn't cover fuzzing anymore, but the fuzzing that was covered in OSE was, I want to say it was using Spike, might have been Peach. Just really basic fuzzing. So I think the RE is definitely a step up, and on a whole, the course is a step up. But at the price point, I would go back and recommend that Ret 2 systems course that I think we talked about some episodes ago.
Yeah.
Just pulling it up now. This course was $1,000, covers a lot more. It's Linux focused. That said, I feel like when you make the change to Windows, you learn some of the specifics there, but the fundamental concepts still remain. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
you're
like you said, I think the biggest change is going to be the pool, like the heap stuff, because in Windows it's not really heap; they call it pools, and it's a bit like weird how it works. But that's probably the biggest difference when you're going from Linux to Windows, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of differences that do come in with Windows and Linux. The thing is, like, they're kind of the thing, like, you learn your foundational concept. Like, you learn to understand ROP and kind of really rock it. And then you can learn these differences. You can learn, like, the common techniques. Like, they do cover the virtual alloc stuff, just calling virtual alloc. Like, that's a common technique. Once you get ROP, you go for doing that. That's fair game. But you can kind of learn that once you learn your foundations. I do think starting off on Linux, well, one, it's a bit easier. Like, Linux exploitation is easier. Windows definitely has a lot more little mitigations to learn, but there are things that kind of add on to your knowledge. Either way, I mean, jumping back onto the actual exploit development course, I'm just disappointed by the looks of it. Obviously, I have not taken it and can't confirm what's in there, but as it stands, I was expecting more out of it. They do say it's 15 hours of video content and more than 600 pages. And, maybe it is. Maybe they probably, well, I doubt they're lying, so it definitely is. But that feels like the wrong metric. Like, 600 pages of PDF content. Oh joy! Like, it doesn't really matter if it's 600 pages, if like every page is filled with an entire screenshot.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I was gonna say it's kind of like that quote from I think it's attributed to Bill Gates with like measuring aircraft building by weight. It just seems like it's kind of a useless metric. It doesn't mean anything on its own. Sorry, you were gonna say something there, Z?
yeah, I was just gonna take Belico chats as wait. Windows have mitigations. What do you mean? I'm talking about like there's a lot of smaller user line mitigations within Windows, especially when you look at formerly EMAT, and now you've got Windows. It's just built into Windows Defender. The exploit mitigations there. Um, Basically, that's what I'm talking about. Those things are a little bit more readily available on Windows than they are on Linux, so you're going to run into a more. My experience has been you're going to run into things like stack canaries a lot more also on Windows. That's it. That the stack canary one has been more just my experience, not I haven't done any study on that. But that's kind of what I'm referring to. Like, there are these little sort of things that Windows does differently. Um,
Yeah,
Out of chat also, uh, Oil Leo, or maybe that's supposed to be a face for the name. It does this course better prepare for the advanced Windows exploit course that OffSec has? Apparently so, at least compared to the OSCE course. I would have to imagine there's still a pretty significant gap between this and OSE.
So I will throw on something that I thought was positive when I was looking through the syllabus.
Yeah,
One
I've been
thing that I
kind of
thought was
negative.
cool,
Sorry.
a little bit, but that's fine. I mean, I had a little bit more of a favorable outlook, I think, on the course than you did, at least at first. Although some of your points are kind of changing me to that direction. But one thing I thought was cool was they have a section on reverse engineering for bugs using IDA. Because just because vuln research is one of those things that's sometimes neglected in exploit dev courses, they just throw like end days at you or some contrived issues. And like reverse engineering is going to be a big part of Windows. That is one thing with Windows is there's less of an open source community on Windows applications. Windows itself is closed source. So I think that angle of covering vuln research from like a black box or gray box perspective is a really like good value add to offer in there.
It
So I
is,
thought that
but
was
they
cool.
only really cover reverse engineering from this concept of hooking. Hooking the receive function, I think, is. I'm trying to find it in the table of contents here.
Yeah, I think it's near the end of
Um,
the
Either way,
course.
it was mostly like the reverse engineering was through hooking, which I like I said, it's fair game, and I think it is an improvement over what they covered in terms of fuzzing. That basically is replacing the old fuzzing section of OSCE. I agree with you. I think it's a better step to kind of teach people that more practical skill that than trying to cover fuzzing. That said, it doesn't go very much. Like it's a positive to show it. Anybody who takes this course though is going to have to run with that a lot more. I guess I should also mention I was talking about all the stack stuff they covered. They do also cover format string exploits. And they start, at least it seems like they start talking a little bit about having the concept of like a write primitive, which is an important mental concept when it comes to modern exploit. Just understanding the idea of primitives. So the format string exploit, is definitely a good step there. Whether or not you're actually finding too many format string exploits these days doesn't matter. I think it's still an important thing to learn just because of the mental aspect of a format string exploit being a write while where style exploit. So like that's definitely a positive too, is including that, starting to talk a little bit about the concept of primitives and weird machines, things like that is definitely an asset. Is definitely a plus here. Like I said, I do think there are things that somebody will learn from this course. Like these are all things that you need to kind of learn. So it's not like there's just nothing to learn in this. I just had maybe my expectations were too high for it. I just had higher expectations.
There's a few bug classes that are notably missing here. You have no UAF, which is probably like the most common bug class that you run into nowadays. So nothing really covering use after freeze, at least from the syllabus. Um, like nothing on race conditions. No like heap stuff. No type confusion. Like there is a lot of stuff missing. I agree. Um, and like so this course is $1,300, like you said, which includes 60 days of lab time. Um, but yeah, like I don't know. I kind of agree. I feel like there should have been a little bit more in here when it came, especially when it came to bug classes. Those are kind of important, I think.
Yeah, like
Um,
this covers like it is an exploit development class, so it does cover some exploits. It's not so much covering any sort of bug classes. We also don't see like even integer overflow. Maybe it'll be in there. Maybe that's how they get something. But
yeah,
I
it's worth
will
noting. All
also
we have to work with here is the syllabus. We don't have the course content, so take what we're saying with that in mind.
yeah, definitely a
Sorry, go
bit
ahead.
of a grain of salt. I was just going to call out also the labs. They've added what appear to be some blind challenges into the lab, which was lacking with OSC. It was just here's a walkthrough on a few vulnerabilities, and that's all the lab were. The lab just had machines vulnerable to those things. It looks like, I don't know for sure, but they do have trying harder the labs in here in challenge 1, 2, and 3. They did this with OSWE also, where they started including some more blind labs for you to actually work through and put into practice. And I think there's a lot of value in that. Uh, I think like with OSCP, their kind of flagship course, they have labs and they have like 50 plus labs. So you get a ton of room to just go and practice the things you're learning about. And I think that would be great if there was an exploit development course that did the same thing, provided you all these labs to just get some practice with. 3 doesn't really do it, but it's an improvement regardless, and it really depends on the types of challenges these are. These could be multi-stage things. These can be really great challenges, so I don't want to downplay their potential there. It's definitely a positive move again that they are including.
So getting into some of the meta information about the course, it's $1,300 with that 60 days lab time, which you can extend for 30 days for $360. One thing that is weird though here is you need to be 18 and have ID to register for it. They say there are some exceptions if you're under 18, if you
That's
undergo
common
rigorous
for
application
OffSec.
checks. Well, I
Um,
well, I thought so too, or I kind of had that thought too. Was is this common? And I looked back through some of the previous courses, like Pen 300, and that requirement wasn't there. So
no,
I don't
you
know
you
if
need that.
it's
I think it's maybe just that they're mentioning it. You need ID to register for all of their courses.
okay.
You
Fair
can't
enough.
even do it from like a Gmail account. You have to use a proper paid email address, presumably a work email address.
Okay,
They have that. That's just OffSec in general does that.
so that's
Um,
just something they don't really mention in the other courses, but they mention it here, I guess. Because I thought that was like specific to this course, or
no,
reading
I
through it,
don't
and I
think
was like,
so.
okay, that's weird.
Maybe the 18 one is because there's definitely been younger people on OSCP, but I imagine that's one of the things where you can just contact them and kind of get the exception done for that. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, they've always had kind of a slightly annoying registration process that involves that, and I think that's largely just because of or trying to protect the certification itself.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Yeah. I just did want to call that out in case there was any like younger people who were like, "Oh, this sounds interesting." But there is that that gate there that you would have to get the exception for. Um,
And if as a final note, I will say, like, thinking about this as a certification, not just the course. Like, I think there's value in this as a course. If you're learning, there's things you need to learn. There's value there. As a certification, I can't imagine myself ever kind of looking at this thing that, yeah, that's what I need, or like that's what I want to hire somebody with. It doesn't get you far enough to actually do modern exploitation. So like it's not relevant for any current job that involves exploitation. It could be an asset for like somebody doing pen testing. You're going to have a better handle on fixing up or working with existing vulnerabilities and existing proofs of concept. So all good there, but as a certification, I can't imagine myself wanting this. That said, it might be like OSWE. I didn't care much for the course, but I loved the actual exam and thus the certification because
okay. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess what I would ask is, you think it comes up short compared to Pen 300 and Web 300?
um it depends on what we're talking about. Like I said, the course I think it's kind of the same as like Web 300.
Or sorry, I meant the cert value. That's what I meant.
It's
Like the value for the how
they
much you're paying
might
for it.
throw something into the certification or that act like into the exam that actually makes it a really good test. That's what they did with OSWE. That made me like it. It was the exam that kind of pulled me back on it because the exam was a really good test of someone's ability to just take a new code base, get up to speed on it, audit it quickly, and like actually start auditing a new code base. It was a good exam for that aspect, and that is a really important skill. The course itself, though, just taught a few tricks, it felt like it wasn't a great course. So yeah, I don't know. I can't really speak to the value of the certification without having sat the exam. But
Yeah,
going
that's
from
fair.
this, it feels like it's just not actually going to be relevant. Like it's not like OSCP where you're getting the methodology out of it. And so, the certification's still relevant even though the content maybe isn't. Exploit development, you need to get up to a certain level for it to be relevant, I guess.
Yeah.
Like in fairness, there are things to learn from it. So as a course, you can learn things from it. I'm not sure what the value of the cert's going to be. That doesn't mean it's going to be bad. I'm purely going off the table of contents, which is definitely a very limited way of judging that.
Yeah. Um, for those that might be interested in taking the course registration has opened up as of January 27th. I don't believe they're actually starting though until March 7th. So um, you do have that window if you want to check it out, and if you do, like, you can leave a comment on our video or anything, and let us know what you thought of the course. See if we were wrong on anything from the table of contents evaluation, I guess. But yeah, with that said, we'll move into some exploits. So we'll start off with a quickie. This was Linksys WRT160NL issue. In those routers, there's a bug in the web panel when it comes to changing the language for the UI. The language is changed by sending a post request to the apply endpoint. And when you do that, they construct a path using the language parameter and pass it to the copy command using system. As you can likely guess, there's no sanitization on that parameter, so you can just break out of it and get command execution. It's a very straightforward issue. This issue hasn't and probably won't be fixed because this product isn't supported anymore. So NCC Group recommends updating the router firmware with an alternative firmware like OpenWRT if you have this router. Um, One thing I'm curious about though is they note that this endpoint is authenticated. You can see in the title they call it an authenticated command injection, which is a little bit weird to me because being able to change the language is something you would think you'd want to expose to the login panel as well. So I was kind of expecting with this vector for it to be an unauthenticated command injection as well. But maybe it uses a different endpoint for the login, or it just doesn't allow you to change the language. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I could
Um,
imagine just not really having any way to change the language. Like you kind of set it globally in a sense, it might be. Where like you set the language for your device so it just starts off as English by default, presumably, and then you can make this call to change it. It does
yes,
seem like a weird way to change the language to actually be effectively just trying to it does a copy command. So it seems like it's literally just replacing one of the files with another file when you change the language. That's going to be a global thing, so you log in, you change the language for the entire device. It's not like every user gets to change it.
yeah, and a login screen, like even if it's not in your language, it's pretty like recognizable, and you know what to do, even if you can't necessarily read all the text on the page. So yeah, that's probably what's going on there. So, but yeah, very quick issue, pretty straightforward. So we'll get into a more interesting issue now, which is vulnerabilities within TikTok's friend finder. So, Checkpoint published a blog post about a method they discovered to abuse TikTok's friend finder feature. They use this method to hypothetically establish a database of users and their associated phone numbers. Uh, if they chose to associate a phone number with their account, that is, you don't have to when you use TikTok. Apparently, I mean, I don't use TikTok, but apparently you can
Yeah,
choose to
they have a
associate it for
browser
login and
interface,
sharing.
I believe.
Yeah.
So that you wouldn't have a phone number for.
So it exists through the contact synchronization functionality. When using TikTok, they prompt you to sync contacts on your phone with TikTok to try to find people you know, which is a pretty standard functionality. That's going to be on most social media applications. But when uploading the contacts from the list, they do try to take some privacy steps, like they hash the name and phone number of the contact with SHA-256 and upload it. And then when synchronizing, the server sends back a list of profiles with those hash numbers and names, as well as the user's ID, profile photos, stuff like that. Now, obviously, they do have to set some limits on that because otherwise, someone can just abuse their contact list to get a response for batches of phone numbers and associate them to accounts, which is exactly what this attack is. So, what they try to do is they limit the requests to 500 contacts per day per user per device. And they also do device registration to try to ensure the user is using a physical device. And they sign requests with the device to the server. The problem here is the token for that device can be extracted to be used virtually. And the other problem is the session cookie for that token lasts for 60 days. So an adversary can basically just use the devices or a device as a signing oracle using something like Frida to hook the signing method. And they can just automate connecting phone numbers with profile details. And it's scalable. Like if you want to do like you get two devices and do 1,000 contacts per day per device if you wanted to, right? Um, so it seems like they tried to prevent this issue from being an issue, and the restrictions were just like way too soft um, when they were going through the design decision. Like,
Yeah, I mean it's a hard thing to do though also. And I don't I don't think you mentioned it yet, but in terms of bypassing the signing, they effectively would just hook the calls to the signing and modify it inline it, have it sign a different message.
Yeah.
Um, so when it comes down to this, like it's a hard problem. Like you create that authentication token, like how do you actually lock that down to only a particular device can reuse that? Especially if you're able to reuse the same IP, so sitting on the same network and stuff. Like it's a hard problem. Uh, I think a better thing would have been, something like a CAPTCHA would be used to prevent automation rather than trying to prevent it in these sorts of way, actually requiring a certain investment. Even CAPTCHAs, though, like you hire a cheap team from a third world country, you can still kind of deal with that. But at least it's a little bit more of a human investment than what we see here. Because ultimately, this just came down to the fact that they could automate the entire process. Um,
Yeah.
like it's not the easiest problem to solve, though. Like I think it's really easy to kind of look at this and just, as you said, like it's just all their restrictions were so soft, but it is a harder problem to solve.
I do kind of question why they have the limits so soft. Like, who has 500 contacts on their phone? Um, like, I don't think I've ever seen anybody with even a tenth of that.
Um, I've
So,
got I've got quite a few contacts imported on my phone. I'm actually just pulling my phone now to take a look at what my number is. I want to say it's in the 300s.
really, okay, maybe I just don't use my contacts enough, and maybe
Well,
I'm out of touch a little bit with phone people.
so kind of the problem with my contacts is a ton of them come because of old, like, if I've logged in on Hotmail, well, I had MSN in my teens. I had a lot of contacts on MSN, and those still exist in my contact list. So you can easily have like these hundreds of people in your contacts, just because of older things, kind of adding them there, registering some information back and forth, and just kind of sticking around if you've had kind of some of the same addresses for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, so they don't talk about how this issue was resolved, but I feel like if I got to make a change, I would just make it so for one, you like maybe keep the 500 contacts, but change it to like monthly because I feel like you probably don't need to like maybe a hard cap of 500 contacts per month or something, right? I think that would probably seem more reasonable and a lot harder to automate on this, or just like you said, you could add a captcha on that as well to make it more difficult to automate. But yeah, it just seems weird that they went through like all this trouble of signing the messages and using per device tokens, but use these like really soft limits and the 60-day sessions too. Those are like you don't need 60-day. Um, I don't think you would need 60-day cookie sessions there either. But I mean, maybe they probably have reasoning for that. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have exactly what changes they made to address this issue. I believe that Checkpoint does state that they addressed it, right? I'm pretty sure it's not just a pot shot at them, but I'm trying to find exactly where they stated that. Yeah, so we were delighted to join TikTok in fixing these issues. So they don't state exactly how the issues were fixed, but um, it's probably just like they changed the limits and I doubt they added the captcha on it because that would probably be annoying for the user experience. So
Well,
yeah.
so there are other ways of doing a captcha, though, like a proof of work style, that are a little bit more invisible, besides just like typing in a captcha code. There's definitely been some progress on making more invisible captchas.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, this one wasn't really a technical bug. It was more just like a design oversight, I guess, and not like taking into account how abusable their system still could be even after going through the steps that they did. So speaking of things being abused, we have another secret club post on yet another lock screen bypass for BitLocker. This was actually inspired by Jonas's bypass, which we covered 2 weeks ago. This researcher decided to weaponize an old bug they found in Windows touch devices. So again, this one, just like Jonas's, exploits the hidden settings menu. Um, but in this case, the instance that launches the lock screen for user prompt is launched as system for some reason. Um, So basically, what they do here is they abuse the forgot your password functionality
So
to bring
I'll
up the virtual
jump in
keyboard.
really quickly. Part of the reason for system is actually kind of security related, so other programs can't just hook onto it. It creates a higher integrity level. So running a system is kind of there for a reason when it's accepting like your password,
But
just for some reason. But
Windows Desktop doesn't do that. It uses IPC and it's launched as user or default user. Sorry.
well, so yeah, I'd have to look in before I comment on that more actually. So I'll
Yeah,
drop it.
the only reason I remember that is because from Jonas's post, his lock screen bypass was very similar to this, but he had to do that additional privilege escalation because the lock screen user was the default user, which didn't really have any privileges. So yeah, in this case though, on like Surface devices, you just get that like system privesc for free with the bypass as well. So getting into the bypass and how it works, they abuse the forgot your password functionality to bring up the virtual keyboard. And in the gray space on the virtual keyboard, for a brief time, you can double tap it to bring up a context menu, which has a settings icon. Um, and then, even though when the settings app is launched, it's hidden, you can connect the physical keyboard to it to navigate the hidden settings window. And just like Jonas's attack, they use autoplay and a USB device to execute the payload. In this case, though, there was no second stage attack needed because, like I said, you have that binary executing as system, not the default user. Um, what's interesting about this report is Microsoft rejected the issue, citing the need for a proof of concept, and they expressed disbelief towards the exploitability of the issue. The researcher stated they provided a POC, even though Microsoft apparently asked for one. Now, obviously, this is only one side of the story. We don't have the bug report and back and forth, so it's hard to comment on this aspect too much. But this does seem like a legitimate bypass, so it seems weird that Microsoft would reject the issue out of hand.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, my guess here is they do say this was an old bug that they found. My guess might be something along the lines of they reported this quite a while ago. At the time, Microsoft didn't care about it, and now maybe
mm,
they might. That's only a guess. We don't know when they reported it initially. Kind of reading through it though, like I kind of got the sense they might have reported it quite a while ago and had it get ignored. So now they just figured out how to weaponize and just publish it without taking it back to MSRC.
yeah, it's a
That's
little bit unclear on that.
yeah, that's pure speculation, as we like to do.
We're the speculation masters, but yeah, I mean, maybe we shouldn't comment on that too much just because there are so many unknowns. My biggest question though here is like I said earlier, and I mean you kind of chimed in on this, see, but like it just seems weird that they would have the lock screen directly running as system. This is the kind of like this is why you would want to use IPC to have the lock screen as default and then do anything sensitive that you would want protected from hooking or something done in a system process. It just seems weird that it would work one way on desktop and in a less secure way on like services. It's just
That does, and I
strange to
agree
me.
with you. That said, like I chimed in there, I know they use system for that integrity level aspect. I just, in this particular case, I'd have to dig into it a little bit more to see why. Like there probably was a reason why they chose to use system here. I just don't. I'd have to look into it further to actually like intelligibly comment on it.
Again, obviously speculation, but one reason I could think of maybe is something with the touch screen. Maybe there's something with the touch screen where they need to be system to like interact with it properly. I don't know, but that's like the only like big device level difference between like a desktop and like a Surface. I would think. Um, that's like the user sees would be the lock screen. There could be more like under the hood differences that require the use of system, but yeah, just that's probably like my most interesting question out of this blog post, and something we're probably not going to get the answer to honestly, but
Yeah, I mean, I
it's fun
I
to think
just
about.
like this post just because it's such a simple issue. Plug in a keyboard basically, or get the on-screen keyboard, get the settings, just like Jonas's one. It's just a great vulnerability because
Hmm.
it doesn't require like any sort of buffer overflow. It doesn't require memory corruption. It's just here's a design decision that has an overlooked security problem. And I just love those exploits because it's readily understood. It's something that you just have to think about the software to kind of start discovering it or just playing around with it. It's not something that takes some really deep understanding. Or at least not a deep understanding of like how software works, like a lot of the buffer overflows and such that we cover.
Yeah, and we've been seeing quite a bit of them lately. Somebody from chat mentioned, I heard about some kids found one on Linux by keyboard mashing. Yeah, we covered that one a couple weeks ago, I think, on the lock screen bypass one. There was a Mint 20 issue that was much the same with the virtual keyboard. It wasn't about launching settings. That one was, I think, crashing the daemon for the login. And sometimes, if you crashed a certain way, it would just bypass it, and you could get into the system. But yeah, like there's been a lot of like lock screen bypasses in the last like couple months. I guess people are inspiring other people to get into that stuff, and yeah, they're fun bugs. I agree. So let's get into another big topic. The NAT slipstreaming attack. So Ben Siri from Armis posted that they found a new variant of the NAT slipstreaming attack, which can be used to attack any devices on internal networks from the internet through malicious link clicks. So we talked about Sammy Kamkar's original NAT slipstreaming attack back in October. This was on episode 51. Actually, I guess we would have talked about it in November because the attack was published October 31st. Um, and that was the V1 of this attack, which was essentially using packet fragmentation to sneak in and craft a packet to send to the application level gateway from the browser. One way they did this, I think, was using the max transmission units. And they basically smuggled SIP requests into the ALG. Um, so browsers released a patch to try to mitigate this issue. I'm not entirely certain what those mitigations were. They don't talk about them in the blog post, unfortunately. I wish they did. Um, I would imagine it's something like browsers maybe are not able to send SIP packets anymore, but I'm not totally sure on that. Again, I'm speculating there.
So I believe part of it at least was the addition of whatever port they were using to like the restricted port list. That
Oh
said,
yeah, true.
with this one, it's still a similar attack, except instead of using SIP, they end up using another VoIP protocol, the H323 protocol, which kind of has the unique feature of supporting call forwarding, which has that aspect of you can have traffic being sent from one being forwarded over to a third IP. So where with SIP, you only had access to the actual victim device, you can get access to any port on that device, presuming you knew their internal IP. In this case, you can kind of set up call forwarding to forward your messages along to any device in the network that you want to. It's similar in that it's still, you kind of forging that packet and smuggling that, in this case, H323 packet in there, so that the firewall might see it as that if it doesn't deal with fragmentation properly. And then they also talk about abusing the WebRTC. Um, Going through turn, you don't, or it doesn't reference the in-browser restricted port list, so you can access and get requests going out to any port from that. So I thought
Yeah,
it was kind of an interesting hack. It just required knowing about basically H323.
yeah. I thought that that WebRTC like second stage attack was kind of cool too. Because it's kind of like another smuggling issue. They basically use the username field in combination with tweaking the max segment size of the TCP packets. And they use that to be able to send arbitrary TCP packets to any port they want, such as like the FTP port or whatever. So yeah, like this bypasses the original mitigations introduced for the first NAT slipstreaming attack, and it's more powerful because, like you said, you can hit like any device on the internal network. Um, I will say, like, this write up was so much easier to understand, and cutting through the cruft was a lot easier for me than it was with the first Snatch slipstreaming attack we covered. I think you mentioned at the time when we covered it that there was a lot of background information that wasn't like super necessary. That is one thing that I loved about this blog post was this was explained a lot more clearly than I initially thought it would be before I clicked on the article. So I got to give props to Armis here. This is a really good write up, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. And we did just have a question in chat asking if this is the same as the Sammy one. Um oh, apparently Sammy has updated his website. It just ends up linking over to here though. Yeah, read. Sorry, I'll bring up Sammy's website here as I'm talking about it. So out of chat, Sammy's website used to have the V1 here as like his write-up that he did on it, and now he just links over to the one that we're covering, which is version 2 of this, of the attack.
Yeah, it's actually really strange how he did that. He titles it NAT Slipstreaming V2, which would make you think it's a write up about V2, but it's literally just the link there. Sorry, like the rest of it is just the V1 attack. So it's just a little bit weird how he set that up. But yeah, that's the V1 explanation. The V2 is entirely on the Armis site.
So it looks like he does include actually. I didn't take a look at Sammy's page here to know said update, but he does actually have some updates regarding how V2 works.
Where's
Um,
that? I didn't see that at all.
well, if you kind of scroll through, you'll see mentions of H323 now and how V2 works versus how V1 works. So it kind of has a comparison there, which is a good
Okay.
shout, actually.
All right. Yeah, fair enough. I didn't think he. When I was looking through it, it looked the same, but I
Yeah,
didn't like.
scrolling through it, it does look the same, but then you'll notice those few places bracket V2 and goes into the V2 information. That said, I agree with you that the one from Armis was quite well done. Good write up.
Yeah. Um. So we'll move on to Libgcrypt. So this topic also blew up last week, partially because of some of the drama, which I won't really get into. It's kind of adjacent, but not really related to this issue, as well as the fact that PGP's audience is infosec people. So I mean, I will talk about the drama for a quick second. It was basically related to some of the issues that were tagged to it, like the Git scheme being recommended in docs for cloning instead of using SSL and stuff like that. That's why I wasn't really going to get into it too much. But yeah, with this issue specifically, libgcrypt had a heap buffer overflow when dealing with message digest data. It's caused by an integer underflow when reading the digest byte count for the block. So when they're writing a block, they do a bounds check on the length of how much to copy by subtracting the digest byte count field from the block size. The problem is that count field can get set to a value larger than the block size in the digest final function, which I believe is due to another fix they tried to implement to prevent timing attacks on the length of hash messages.
Yeah, I
There was like
wouldn't
a side
say
channel.
necessarily a fix for it. Like I imagine that would have been in there pretty early on. That's just keeping computations at a consistent time. So it will write the same amount of blocks every time, even if it doesn't actually need to write that many blocks. Like I always write 32 blocks, even if only like 30 blocks are actually part of the message. It's just so the timing remains the same. Might have been there as a fix, but that might have been in there right from the beginning. Like that sort of timing attack has been well known for a long time.
I actually, the way I read it, it was actually introduced in 1.9. I think that that was why
Well, the
1.9
bug
was the
was
only
introduced,
version
but
affected.
okay, perhaps. On that note, I do also have the fix commit that we'll include in the description. Fix is pretty much what you expect. It checks if the count is greater than the block size and resets the count.
Yeah, pretty straightforward fix. Um, so because of the impact, they advise people to stop using libgcrypt 1.9.0 and use 1.9.1. They actually removed the tarball for 1.9.0 entirely. Um, it is worth noting, though, um, no GNU-PG version was affected here because no version used that version of the library. So this is like just libgcrypt. It's not an issue in like GPG release binaries. Um, so yeah, the impact isn't quite as large as you might think it would be initially reading into it. Um, but yeah, this is it's just basically failing to consider that like redundancy of writing the blocks to prevent the timing attacks. Um, maybe I am pretty sure that that came in recently, but like you said, Z, that attack has been known about for a while, and is probably like the first type of attack you would try on crypto. So maybe there was another change that made 1.9 vulnerable, and that's been there for a while. I'm not 100%
Yeah, I
certain on that.
couldn't. I tried looking a little bit to see if I could find or understand exactly how it was introduced. I didn't end up getting on that. They do include the commit hash there, though, so it is something you can take a look at if you're interested.
Yeah, to be fair, the GNU PG stuff is kind of annoying to navigate. There were a few like references to this issue where it was like blocked off. It required a login, and it was like you're not authorized or something. But then there was this, which has all the technical details of the bugs. So I don't. It was just weird navigating it. It's kind of a difficult site to navigate, in my opinion. But um, yeah, bottom line is it's fixed now, and if you use Libgcrypt for any projects, you should update it to 1.9.1 if you were using 1.9. Um, so we'll keep on the train of heap overflows. We have another one, which is a heap-based buffer overflow in Sudo. So this was another critical issue. It's exploitable by anyone. You do not need to be in the sudoers file, and it can allow full root privilege escalation on versions going all the way back to July of 2011, apparently. And it's an issue when they try to handle command line arguments in shell mode. So that's when you pass like the shell flag or through the I option, which sets the mode shell flag on sudo itself. Um, so when handling command line args, they try to rewrite the argv to concatenate all the commands passed by the user into a string to format it into that -c arguments form, and they escape the metadata characters internally. Then later, when running the sudoers policy routine, they try to unescape those meta characters when setting the user arguments for end quotations here sudoers matching and logging purposes. The problem comes in when they try to deal with those unescaping meta characters. If the mode gets confused between the shell and edit modes, um, problems start to pop up because the user can essentially insert their own escapes and mess with the math that goes into parsing the and unescaping the arguments.
Yeah, and the math in this case, like it's not terribly complicated. I've got the code up here and highlighted. It's literally it iterates over the arguments until it gets to a null. And then it kind of does that inside of for each particular one, iterates over it. So where the issue end up coming in, like the math is pretty straightforward. If from 0, so if like the current character is a backslash and the next character is not a space, it just skips the backslash and copies in the space when it gets to the next line there, where it's actually setting it in the destination buffer, and then it sets then it sets a space after it. Um, as I guess I've kind of interrupted you on that, but as you're going to get to, the
Yeah, no
issue
worries.
comes in with when you're able to kind of confuse the modes a little bit, you're able to control where all those backslashes are. And if you have as the last character of your argument a backslash, then that means it's a backslash and then a null byte, which is going to ask the check where it looks for the backslash. It's like, is there a backslash? Okay, it's not a space next, so let's just skip forward, copy that character, and keep going through the loop. And because they move that iterator forward, it never fails the null check to see like while from. It's looking to see if it's a falsy value. So if it's a null, it never ends up failing that. So it just kind of keeps going and keeps copying until it actually does run into a null. So that leads to the out of bounds.
Yeah, and it's a powerful out of bounds too because you have a lot of control over like the size of the overflow, right? They ended up finding like three different ways to exploit this bug. But basically, like this wouldn't be an issue if you couldn't set both the edit and shell modes. And how they managed to do that was they used the sudo edit command and the -s flag on that. And the reason that works is because if sudo gets executed as sudo edit, the mode edit flag is set, but the valid flags don't get changed, and the valid flags have that mode shell flag allowed by default. So that's why you can mix both of them.
And I've just, for what it's worth, I pulled up the fix material, so that'll be down in the description. All they did was, or all that they did that really mattered is they checked the characters in null now also.
Yeah. So not only is this a powerful privilege escalation, but it's also like an ideal overflow, as they note. Um, and to try to exploit this vulnerability, instead of like just trying a bunch of strategies on their own, they basically brute force triggering the vulnerability. They kind of fuzzed it in a sense, and they found three different exploitable paths or objects that they could use, and they exploited all three of them actually. So the first way was they overwrote the process hooks getEnd function pointer in the sudo hook entry object to get code execution. They basically did a partial overwrite on that to make it call execv instead, with which would call it would call it with user provided arguments. That wasn't perfectly stable because ASLR was still at play in the upper bits, but because it's in user land and you could just keep running it, they could just keep running it until it worked, which would take less than 4096 tries, probability wise. The second strategy was a string overwrite in the service user structure, which is used for loading libraries. They could basically smash the library name to load their own shared library as root. The third way was smashing a def timestamped objects directory, which gets written to, and they race it with a symlink to get an arbitrary write of stack contents into a file as root. And they use that to smash the etc password file to inject a root user in there. I think the coolest exploit path in terms of ingenuity was probably that third option of inducing the race uh, arbitrary file write through the symlink. The most practical exploit, though, probably if you were going to use this and you cared about stability, was probably the second one, to load your own library. That seems like the path of least resistance, I guess, when you're talking about exploit strategies.
Yeah, least
Um,
resistance. I'd agree there. I did find using the Etsy password overwrite. I like that one again. It's just a fun way to attack it when you're able to get that. It's super loud. I mean, you're overwriting Etsy password, so like it's not like that's going to be quiet.
yeah. And the first issue was cool, but again, it's very noisy. It's going to be crashing a lot. Um, so yeah, that second strategy is definitely the best way to go. But yeah, I mean, this is a cool bug. Is this is the bug that somebody in our Discord was trying to exploit, right? Or was I confusing that with
Somebody in our
the
Discord
PG?
is I mean, there's a lot of people trying to exploit this one right now. I believe there have been some proof of concepts. The only link that I had kind of immediately available is this one, which out of chat, uh it's mentioned that it may not work, although it does mention that the offsets are basically hard coded. That it might work, but most systems you're probably going to have to mess with the offsets a little bit.
Oh, okay.
But it is a proof of concept that you can at least take a look at. I think there are some other ones. I don't have the links ready or on me. If I come across them, though, I'll probably just share them in our Discord.
Yeah. So there's this kind of I guess race or challenge to try to exploit this issue. So if you're looking for something fun to do and you're bored, I mean this might be something to take a look at. It seems like a fairly straightforward issue to like exploit. It's just the exploit angle is where you get creative, and that's what's fun. I think for
Yeah,
me,
I mean
I
that's
enjoy
the
the
thing
exploit dev more than vuln research. So
with
this was a
this
fun challenge.
with this one. You've definitely kind of got that. Like you've got a good, powerful bug, but in an ideal world, you'd probably want to change this, or sorry, chain this with like an info leak or something of that nature, which would make it a lot more stable. But you don't have that aspect of it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, fun issue.
So before we move on to the next topic, though, we do have a question of chat from root email. Do you think C/C++ is going away anytime soon? Every time this sort of stuff hits HN, there's a huge discussion about how everything should be rewritten in safe languages like Rust or something. I don't think C is going away anytime soon. I would
No.
like to see more things incorporating Rust, incorporating safer languages, but there's a certain ease that comes with working with C that, and obviously there's a lot of momentum when it comes to working with C. A lot of old hats that just want to keep working with C. So it's going to take a while before we kind of start seeing a move or a move away from it. I don't think it's going to disappear anytime soon, especially on the more resource constrained systems.
There's a lot of monolithic projects that are written in C or C++. Most operating systems are written in C. Most browsers are written in C++. Most game engines, in fact, I don't know if there's any game engines that aren't written in C++ because it's just so like anything that needs a lot of performance is going to be using those languages. There has been kind of a push to move to Rust. Like I mentioned earlier, Mozilla had I forget the name of the project, but they had a project to try to rewrite Firefox or re-implement Firefox in Rust.
Yeah, well, that was
Obviously, that got
Servio.
killed. Servio, that's right.
Yeah, but that was like they had that project way before Rust was even like that was like they were basically dogfooding Rust when they started it.
Yeah,
Like it was actually never even meant to be a public project. It was always just supposed to be they're just dogfooding it using Rust just to use it. And then it became more of a public project and they started incorporating more, but that wasn't ever the intent with it. But there is more option. Like at I want to say the 2020 Linux Security Summit, there was actually talk about incorporating Rust into the kernel, for example. You
oh
might
no.
start seeing it with drivers.
Oh no, please no.
There's been that sort of discussion going on. So like there's a trend. There are people that want to move to safer languages. It's there. It's definitely happening. I don't think C is going to disappear anytime too soon, though, either.
I mean, for people who are wondering why I'm saying "oh no," Rust is one of those languages where it's cool. You know, the idea of implementing something like C, but with the memory safety built in, is cool. And without like a ton of performance loss, like you would have in a scripting language, obviously. But Rust, I really dislike Rust syntax. I really hate like reading it. It makes me very sad trying to read Rust, and I doubt I would ever want to struggle through writing it either. Because writing Rust is kind of a pain in the ass. You got to fight the borrow checker. You got to deal with the annoying syntax. Like I just feel like Rust is not the language I would want big projects to switch to. I feel like I would want them to switch to something built off of Rust, which obviously we don't
Everybody's
really
moving
have
to
yet.
Zig.
I mean, Zig is kind of the. It seems to be like it looks promising. I've heard a lot of good things about it from
Yeah, I
people,
haven't
but
gotten to play with it yet, so I just kind of joke about it most of the time. Oh, one of the questions I'll chat is Rust as fast as C? One of the things about Rust that makes it interesting is they've had an emphasis on what they refer to as zero cost abstractions. That is, it implements a lot of abstractions that make it kind of nicer to code in, but that don't actually cost anything at runtime. They're things that the compiler can kind of check and do for you. So that does actually give Rust a pretty good performance. I'm not going to comment on if it's as fast as C, because really comparing languages, it comes down to what you're actually trying to do. It's hard to say this language is faster or is slower, unless there's like the significant architectural difference, like interpreted language versus a compiled language. Then you've got it as very clear. When it comes down to native code, it's going down to native code. It really just comes down to who has the better optimizations for your particular problem.
yeah. And one thing I'll mention about those compile time checks that you mentioned is Rust does have pretty good runtime performance. I think it is like on a lot of benchmarking, it does trade blows with C, but the compile time performance sucks because you're running so many checks at compile time that like I couldn't imagine building an operating system or a browser in Rust and how painful that would probably be. The compile times might be as far as like double as like twice as long. Um, so that is one angle where there is a pain point there when it comes to Rust, and it might be at least one factor of why it's not being adopted into major projects. Not only would it take a ton of time to rewrite and re-implement everything in Rust, but it also comes at an added overhead of development time with the compile times and stuff like that, which sucks. So Yeah, I mean, Rust is cool and languages like it are cool, but it's just there's some problems with it, and I don't think it'll overtake C or anything in a major way anytime soon. No. But yeah, with that said, we can move into more Windows stuff. So we have a second part blog post, or 1.5, if you want to take the title's versioning, of exploiting a simple Windows kernel vulnerability by Yarden Shafir. So the first part was exploiting a simple vuln in 35 easy steps or less back in November, which we covered in episode 55. Now, this blog post isn't directly related to that one. They weren't chained together, but she found this issue while researching event tracing internals, which was what the first blog post covered. So it's basically it's an info leak that can allow you to get half of a pointer into non-paged pool on x64 as almost any user on the system. You can get the top 32 bits of a kernel pointer. So there's a good bit of background information here that I'm going to kind of glance over. But what's relevant for the issue is there's a hidden ability to request replies when sending ETW notifications. And the first post kind of touched on this as well. So usually this field is set to 0, but you can set it to 1 in the header when queuing a notification. Um, but essentially, when you request a reply, a kernel object gets allocated and pointed to in the notification through the reply object field. But this field is actually in a union. It can be treated as either a reply handle, a reply object, or a reg index, which I assume means registry index, but I'm not certain on that. I couldn't find what the reg part of that was relevant to. But basically, you can get a notification in the queue created with a reply object, then call NT trace control, which gets that union copied out to user space, which is intended behavior. But one thing they didn't account for was reg index is 8 bytes on 64-bit systems, not 4 bytes. So the top half of the kernel pointer ends up getting leaked. And what's interesting is because like this issue wasn't a problem on 32-bit because pointers and longs are the same size. So it's just a discrepancy that kind of got skipped over when moving to 64-bit. They didn't consider that 8 bytes is copied out, but only 4 bytes gets initialized because of that union. And sorry, reg index, I guess, would have been a long, sorry, so not 8 bytes. I got that kind of confused there. So yeah, the reg index, so the lower 4 bytes gets initialized, but the upper 4 bytes are left uninitialized. So if there was a kernel pointer in there, then those upper 32 bits are going to get leaked. So it's only a partial info leak, but that still could be useful depending on your situation. Um, but yeah, I mean, this was a cool issue, and it's extremely easy to trigger. You could reliably trigger this issue like 100% of the time, as I understand it. There's not really any factors for variance with this issue. The POC is literally just 3 function calls. Um, but I do just want to shout this type of issue is exactly why I dislike unions and when people use them a lot. I understand they have a purpose, and this is kind of a debated topic. I think I've actually got into a debate with you about this, C. But it feels like a lot of the time when people are using unions, they're penny pinching on memory usage. I
No,
mean,
I
you're
don't
gonna.
think we've debated this one because I agree with you. I'm not a fan
Oh,
of
really?
unions.
Okay. Must have been somebody else. But yeah, I mean, you're gonna introduce confusion and potential bugs into your code to save like 4 bytes of memory. Um, I mean, most systems. I mean, this code is kind of old, but most systems nowadays, most people are running at least 8 gigs of memory. To put that into perspective, when you're using a union, you're worrying about saving like four to the negative 10th power of a percent of memory. What are you doing? Just don't use unions. I mean, I don't mind when people use them for aliasing. Like if you're doing like maybe texture drawing or something, and you have RGB and you have the RGB is integers or is like a byte buffer, like something like that is fine. But I feel like people use unions dangerously a lot, and I don't know why. It just doesn't really seem like it's worth it from like a readability perspective. Like you're sacrificing readability and potentially introducing bugs to save a few bytes. Like it's kind of jokes. So yeah, I wanted to rant a little bit about unions off this topic.
No, it's a good rant. It's one of those features that I'd argue probably introduces more bugs than it really helps solve. Like you said, it adds so much complexity to trying to understand the code. There are certain patterns where I think it can be nicer to use a union, but I'd still kind of push away from it. Like, I generally wouldn't write any code or suggest writing code with unions. Especially now, like, memory isn't as much of an issue anymore. Even when we talk about the network aspect of it, like if you're using that for a network packet, I think there's a stronger argument to be made on the network side than on just the memory savings, on saving actual network traffic, but it's still such a small amount with modern systems. Like, even on a bad connection, like 4 bytes isn't that much, but it might add up. Like, there are probably some scenarios you can make a stronger argument for, but I feel like it's better to just use like a separate structure or something rather than trying to make it a union to some of that. Oh no, I'm not a fan of unions either. I think it's a good rant. It's worth bringing up at least.
Yeah, it feels like one of those older features that maybe at the time it made more sense, but it's just as time has gone on, it's not worth it anymore, and people should probably stop using them. That said, we'll finish off with our last Windows issue. This is a post from ZDI. Um, this one's not in the event tracing, but it's in the Win32K full graphics subsystem. So it's a null pointer dereference. Now, usually we wouldn't cover a null deref because they're almost always uninteresting from an exploitation perspective beyond denial of service. The reasoning for that is most systems will allocate a null guard page so that you can't map anything to the null virtual address. But in this case, there is a potential avenue for privileged escalation, though it's extremely specific and rare circumstances. Getting into the issue first, though, graphics device drivers have this ability to register hooks or custom handlers for certain graphics operations on drawing surfaces in the kernel, which is really common in kernel, specifying like those types of hooks or modules or whatever they're called. Um, and one of the hooks you can specify is the PLG BLT hook, which is for doing bit block transfers for color data from source rectangles to destination rectangles. And the way you enable that hook is you can just enable it by setting a flag from user mode through GDI32. The problem is if you set that flag, um, they try to call into the function table as if a hook is provided, but it's not guaranteed that the graphics driver you're using will actually export a function for it. So if you try to call into, let's say, like the multi-monitor driver provided by Win32K full, there's a null dereference when it goes to call that hook. Normally, that would result in a crash. Where the privilege escalation angle comes into play is on 32-bit systems with NTVDM installed for running 16-bit processes. It's actually possible to map the null virtual page there. Even though it isn't possible to map null on modern Windows machines, um, in those 16-bit circumstances, you can map to null. I don't know what the reasoning for that is, but I imagine it's probably because in 16-bit your address space is so limited that they probably just didn't want to use a guard page, didn't want to carry that over. It probably would have broke things, honestly. And one of Windows' big things is not breaking compatibility with old stuff. So that's probably why they removed the null guard page there. Um, but yeah, I mean, even though it's an extremely specific circumstance, it is one of the few instances where privilege escalation is technically still possible with the null deref. That being said, I can't lie when I say that I felt a bit clickbaited by the title. I was hoping there was some novel new technique for making null derefs exploitable on modern Windows, but that's not actually what's happening here. It's only on 32-bit Windows with 16-bit process capability, and it's only if there's no SMAP as well, because obviously 0 is going to be in user space. So if the system has supervisor mode access prevention, you're not going to be able to exploit the issue either. Although on a system that's running 16-bit processors, you're probably not going to have SMAP anyway.
I think you're
Um,
also less likely to run to SMAP on Windows in general. Um, just because of you kind of need the buy-in from all the driver developers too. So there is support for it. I just don't think it's enabled by default. I'd maybe have to go look into that. Somebody else had pointed that out to me a little while back in a discussion that SMAP's a little bit less likely to be seen on Windows just because of the fact that a lot of drivers kind of make the assumption of being able to make those accesses. Or it might only be SMAP that I'm thinking.
Yeah, so I remember Ionescu talked about this too, actually, because SMAP landed in 2018, but it landed in like a very limited capacity at first. I don't know if that's changed over the last like couple months or last year or so. I don't do enough Windows stuff to keep up to date on that, but yeah, that's a good shout out. Is Windows is so much harder to like push anything through on the kernel side because the driver ecosystem is just so much more of a problem to deal with than it is on like Linux, for example. There's so many Windows drivers. There's so many crappy Windows drivers. So yeah, I mean, definitely don't blame Microsoft for that. But yeah, I mean, this was still kind of a cool blog post. But yeah, I mean, if you were thinking that this was going to make null deref suddenly exploitable again on like Windows 10 or something, uh, that's not what's happening there, unfortunately.
At least the title wasn't as clickbaity as the North Koreans with their DOS to RCE exploit.
Yeah,
At least like they were, in fairness to ZDI, like they were clear about the potentiality with this one. They just covered it. And I thought it was interesting to cover because we often end up just talking about nullity references, not generally too exploitable these days with kernel. And this was just a case where, okay, there are cases where it still is exploitable. It's not the normal case, but I felt it was still worth bringing up.
yeah. So we'll move into our research segment. So this kind of ties back to something that Auntie said actually in that North Korea discussion, which I'll talk about in a second. So this is a novel cross-site leaking technique from Lewin Herrera. These slides were from a talk he gave at the XS Leaks Summit or cross-leaking summit. It abuses the HTTP redirect fetch from the Fetch API in browsers. The protocol specification states that there should be a maximum of 20 redirects, and after 20 redirects, it should return a network error. So he got the idea of what if we use that as a side channel to leak information. So basically, what they do is by padding redirects with an attack page and then redirecting to the target page, an attacker can basically figure out whether or not a page was loaded or if they were again redirected or if they would have been redirected. So like think of trying to access like an admin panel and if you had to be redirected to a login page or something like that. Um, Now, where I was saying this kind of connects back to Anti is Anti was talking about browsers and how the centralization of everything moving towards Chromium means that like even non-memory corruption exploits, things like cross-site leaking, if they're like browser specific. This one I don't think is too browser specific because it's a specification issue, but like cross-site leaking is another thing where if a lot of things use the same browser, those cross-site leaks are going to be easier to hit more people with. But I just kind of wanted to tie it back to that. I didn't want to bring it up at the time because we're already kind of going really long on the discussion. But um, yeah. But anyway, I mean, getting back to this issue, I don't think it seems like a super useful thing to leak. Like knowing if somebody is logged into something. I mean, maybe
But
you
you
could use
can,
that to time an attack or something, but
I mean, we've seen things like advertisers or insurance companies actually, in some countries, using it to see if some are using other techniques to see if somebody was say logged into Grinder to see if they're likely gay, and then using that to actually well discriminate in a lot of those cases. That's something. So this same attack could be used for something like that. It's not like the fact that you were redirected doesn't seem like a terribly sensitive piece of information, but it can definitely be used in a lot of cases to determine if you are logged in on something. Like you can get some interesting information out of that.
yeah, I mean, I like these cross-site leaks because they take advantage of pieces of data, like you said, that people think as trivial. They think, oh, who cares? But like, yeah, I mean, there is possible scenarios. Like, I never even thought about that. That's a good point with like the grinder situation, actually. Um, But yeah, like I like these little like side channels and taking advantage of little known specification bullet points and abusing them. It's cool. It is a really short like there's only 22 slides, which for a talk like I don't know if there's like a recording of the talk, but I couldn't imagine it being that long.
No, it might have
So
been a bit easier to understand what was going on within the presentation if there were a talk attached to it. Like you could figure out what they're talking about for sure. It did take me a little bit to get like, okay, they're talking about the redirects. Like that is the information that you're able to leak. Like just without having the actual discussion alongside of it. Like it's a well done slide deck for somebody presenting, not for reading after the fact. Out of Chapley asks what's wrong with gay people, by the way. I'm not trying to say anything's wrong with gay people. There have been some countries such as Iran who have been caught trying to detect um if people are logged into sites like Grindr. So I was using that as an example where even this redirect information can be fairly sensitive.
yeah, we were talking about like hostile nations and stuff that do take issue with like
Um,
in their political climate with that.
so I
Not the views we hold.
Yeah,
Definitely
and
not.
I think some insurance companies have actually used that sort of detection also in order or use or health insurance, use that and then use that as a reason to raise some insurance rates.
Really?
Um,
That's messed
I
up.
I feel like I've read about that before. Obviously, not using this technique for it. They were probably just using one of the image loads, but yeah, there has been. That's why I kind of use the grinder aspect because there have been some very targeted things trying to figure out if somebody is likely gay. Like that is something that has definitely been done before. It's unfortunate, but so that's somewhere though that this redirect can also expose a good deal of information on that front. But yeah, it's not our beliefs that are. We're not talking about how we might use it.
Yeah, I mean the technical aspects of this attack are cool, but where this would attack or where this attack would probably be used is definitely like that's one of the only like practical applications I could see of using something like this. Unfortunately,
Yeah, I mean,
um,
advertising in general can learn a lot on the base of what sites you might be logged into. So that's another place
yeah,
where you can
too,
expect it.
yeah,
Um,
but yeah, unfortunately, we don't live in the perfect world, so um, we'll move on to our last research topic, and then we'll do some shoutouts to wrap up the show. This is a post from GitHub Security Lab. It's the second part of their "Keep Your GitHub Actions Secure" series. The first part of which we didn't cover on the podcast because it came out on the same day that we went on our Christmas break, pretty much. Um, but that one focused on interacting with pull request workflow triggers and workflows and how dangerous that can be. This one is about forms of untrusted input in general when it comes to workflows, covering pull requests, but also covering more than just pull requests, like issues and comments and stuff like that. And the funny thing is, we've seen this kind of talked about before. Back on episode 52, it was with the VS Code repository. They had a workflow that took newly opened issues and copied them to another repo, but the issue titles were printed to std out, which allowed for command injection. And issue titles are actually the first thing on their list here of potentially untrusted input. But there's a lot more on that list too, such as commit messages and pull request information, comments. And the reason using these untrusted inputs in your workflow could be dangerous is because you can set up machines as self-hosted runners, which run workflows for you on your own box. And this is pretty much necessary for really large projects because GitHub's hosted workflow runners are pretty heavily restricted. I think they can only run for like 5 minutes or something, and even then their resources are limited. So somebody could potentially like do something malicious on your box if you're using a self-hosted runner. But even if you're not, that aside, like someone abusing a poorly set up workflow could potentially inject malicious stuff into the CI build artifacts or the final build files, which I think is what happened with VS Code. I think they made it inject something that got ran by Node.js or something like that. It's been a while. I can't remember the specific details around that.
yeah, I
Um,
think the one that you're thinking of, what they were doing was uh it had it had certain actions that could be triggered on the basis of standard output. Like you could trigger further actions if you controlled what was in standard output. Like you can set the certain environment variables that would be used later.
Yeah,
That
right.
was the one that you're thinking of.
Yeah. So basically, like, there's multiple vectors that you could exploit untrusted input in workflows, and that's kind of what they're trying to highlight here. This is like a PSA post. Um, And like some of the other things that can happen too is like they could steal repo secrets from that runner context, like the repository write access token, environment variable secrets. Um, GitHub Actions will attempt to prevent secrets from leaking through the log, but they state that that's not actually a security boundary. That's more just a protection against like people accidentally leaking things to log. There's nothing stopping someone who's determined enough to exfil by like wrapping the secrets in obfuscation or something. So they end off the post with what you should do if you absolutely need to use untrusted input in workflows, which is basically utilizing intermediate and environment variables instead of directly using them. Um, but yeah, I mean, this is a good informative post that anyone who manages a project and uses GitHub Actions, or probably any form of continuous integration on like it, honestly, should probably give a read. Workflows are really awesome for CI, but they're also really powerful, and they can be abused by anyone who can, open issues or add comments or make commits or something like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting attack vector because of that. Like anybody can open the pull request. So you might think it's kind of innocuous. Yeah, just echo the name in here and let's use that. Not really thinking of the fact that hey, an attacker can actually control that because you kind of think of the information is coming from GitHub, so it's a little bit more trusted. Or at least that's what I can imagine. Kind of going through a developer's mind is okay. This is the information from GitHub. It must be safe. Kind of seeing it as having gone through that. So I thought it was a really good write up, just kind of covering it. Like they don't cover any sort of specific attack on like some well-known thing. It's just a bit of research on here's some things you should be aware of.
Yeah, and that's totally fair that they wouldn't cover like specific attacks where this is coming out of GitHub Security Lab. They probably wouldn't want to help anybody who's trying, like, who finds an issue
In
like
fairness,
this
they
and
do
exploit it.
write-ups also. Like this is just part of their research, but they do actually do write-ups about other vulnerabilities. We've talked about stuff they've covered before. I just included this though because I think it's really valuable as a reference.
Yeah, for sure. Um, but yeah, like I will quickly shout out as well. If you are doing like project management and you're not using GitHub Actions or CI at all, I do recommend looking at it. Obviously, do it securely, like this blog post is saying. But like GitHub Actions is a really awesome feature that got added to GitHub. I think it was added like last year. I think it was in like a closed beta or something in 2019 or something like that. But yeah, I mean it's a really awesome feature. Just you just got to be careful when you use it. That's all. So we can move into our shoutout section. I'll do my shoutout first. I literally just saw this on Twitter shortly before we went live today, but it's a video by Billy Ellis. He's done a lot of tutorials, and he also wrote a book in the past about like getting into ARM and iOS and iOS security. So I wanted to quickly shout this out. It's a video on how ASLR works. Sorry, how ASLR works in the kernel when it comes to iOS. Um, and it provides that background knowledge, which is something that we like shouting out on this show. It's something that's not always easy to find, especially when you're talking about iOS, where it's such a gated target. Like anything Apple is going to be kind of tricky to get into. So yeah, I mean, this is cool. If you're looking to get into iOS stuff or just want to know how ASLR works, give this video a listen. It's not that long. It's only like 12 minutes long. So you can just put it on and listen to it while you're doing something or whatever. Um, but yeah, that's mine. Z, I'll let you get into your shoutouts now.
Yeah, so my shout out actually kind of follows on yours, at least in the sense of covering a little bit about iOS. Project Zero put out another post. Look at iMessages in iOS. It's a lot of background on the sandboxing, on the architecture. Not so much any attack, just a good look at the background. So we're not going to cover it here. I did want to leave it as a shout out for here's some background to go reference. I found it a little bit interesting. I didn't read the entire thing, if I'm being honest. Um, but yeah, I still want to kind of give that a shout out. And on a similar vein, Mozilla's Attack and Defense blog put out a article about effectively fuzzing the inter-process communication layer in Firefox. So a little bit of background on how they do IPC, because that is, I guess it's been around for now a couple of years when they did the Firefox Quantum. That was like the main change that happened there, but a little bit about that, about how that works, and quite literally about getting into actually fuzzing that aspect of Firefox. Getting just some good background information, no actual vulnerability covered, but still worth taking a look at.
All right, cool. So that will wrap up the show. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. You can catch the VODs on Twitch or on YouTube at 6 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays, with previous podcasts also up on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more stuff on Anchor. Feel free to join our Discord and follow us on Twitter. Links are in the description. Once again, I will quickly shout we will be continuing the PS4 stuff tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, 2:30 p.m. Pacific. I think I said 3:30 p.m. at the beginning of the show. I'm sorry. Time zones are difficult. That's why we just need a universal time zone, and for it to actually be used. But yeah, so 5:30 p.m. Eastern, 2:30 p.m. Pacific. The PS4 didn't die, so we're going to be able to continue on that. With that said, though, we'll be back again next week at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific for the podcast, and we will see you all then.